recognized for 60 minutes as the designee of the Majority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my privilege and honor to address you here on the floor of the United States House of Representatives, and I appreciate the honor and the privilege to do that. I came to the floor here tonight to talk to you, Mr. Speaker, and address the body about the issue that is so important to so many millions of Americans, and that's the issue of life. The issue of protecting innocent, unborn human life that doesn't have the ability to speak out for itself, doesn't have the ability to scream for its own mercy, but does have the ability to squirm and move and belch and do all the things that we do outside the womb, and can feel pain, a beating heart, and a throbbing heart of a heartbeat. I mentioned this on the floor here a couple weeks ago of a ultrasound that was sent to me, and with a little baby with 158 beats per minute. And I would take people through some of the pro-life legislation that's been moved or attempted to be moved here in the United States Congress, Mr. Speaker. And I would take you back to 1973 and Roe v. Wade and Doe v. Bolton. Those two bills, those two Supreme Court cases, working in conjunction with each other, essentially translated into abortion on demand. And we saw abortions go from, who knows what the number was? No, we do know. About 35,000 abortions a year in America, a number that I thought was horrible then, to something like 1.6 million abortions in America, now ratcheted down by the weight of the conscience of our society to some number about 1 million or maybe a little bit less than 1 million. Mr. Speaker, we don't get to count that difference between 1.6 million, roughly the peak, and a little under 1 million as 600,000 babies saved every year. Instead, it goes on our conscience the other way. And that's a cumulative total of 60 million babies who have been sacrificed at the altar of this subject called pro-choice, judicial activism. I remind you, Mr. Speaker, that human life is protected in our United States Constitution. It's protected under the 14th Amendment. And we have a constitutional right here in Congress to protect and defend life. In fact, I believe we have a duty to protect and defend life. And so I would first take us to that case of Roe v. Wade and Doe v. Bolton, and the two cases taken together, January 22nd, 1973, and we've marched every year since then, including just last month on January 19th. But essentially this, Roe v. Wade was a case that was built on several Supreme Court precedents, but the one that strikes me the most is the Griswold versus Connecticut case. And that was back in the mid-60s sometime, maybe 1964, where Connecticut had outlawed contraceptives. They were a strong Catholic state at the time, and so they outlawed contraceptives. And Griswold went to court and said, no, we're married, we should be able to buy contraceptives, and the state of Connecticut shouldn't interfere in that. And so the Supreme Court manufactured this thing called a right to privacy, which was, the privacy was protected by contraceptive activities within the marriage. And so that case went in as a precedent case that established a right to privacy. And then there was a follow-up case, and that would be the Eisenstadt case, said, well, it doesn't matter whether you're married, you've got a right to privacy whether you're married or not, so you should be able to buy contraceptives if you're cohabiting rather than being joined together in holy matrimony. And the Supreme Court found in their favor on that case. And then, not that long later, 1973, here comes Roe v. Wade and Doe v. Bolton. Roe v. Wade says, well, there's a right to privacy, so I guess if we're not going to interfere with reproductive choices of married couples or non-married couples, then we're not going to interfere with whether they want to terminate the life of that innocent, beautiful, miraculous little baby. And so they came down with the decision that a right to privacy was more important than the right to life. And on this floor, Mr. Speaker, I've brought this issue up numerous times to remind the body that our Declaration of Independence articulated this very clearly. It laid out the parameters for our Constitution. Our Constitution reflects those parameters in the Declaration. It said there's a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And those are prioritized rights. The priority is this: life is paramount. You can't be subordinate to anybody's liberty, and somebody's pursuit of happiness can't trample on anyone's liberty or their life. And yet the court decided this right to privacy, this liberty, this right to privacy that was manufactured in Griswold versus Connecticut roughly a decade or less earlier was more important than the right of the life of the innocent unborn. And then they got into the concept of viability. But Doe versus Bolton is the one that gave essentially the broad license. The viability piece is, well, can a baby survive at the end of the first trimester? No. The end of the second trimester? Probably not. But into the third trimester, that became more likely. But yet, even that didn't protect that innocent unborn baby, because Doe v. Bolton put these exceptions in here for the health of the mother. And that was defined and included the physical health, the emotional health, the psychological health, the familial health, and age-related factors. So if you get into the emotional health, then that's impacted by mental stability, it's impacted by cash flow, it's impacted by anything. What it amounts to is that this long list carried within it some place there that anybody could look at it and say, well, that's a license to abort a baby under any circumstances, anytime, provided that the mother just simply is willing to, if she wants the abortion. And we've just, a little over a year ago, saw a president leave office that stood on the floor of the Illinois State Senate and multiple times took the position that if a woman goes to an abortionist and wants an abortion, if the baby survives the abortion, she still has a right to a dead baby. And by the way, all the people speaking over here a little bit ago all voted against the bill that protected a baby who is born alive and survives an abortion. And it's abhorrent to me to think that you would abort a baby. But the second thing is that if that baby survives the abortion, to go forward and kill that baby anyway, or put that baby off in a cold room till that baby freezes to death, close the door, shut off the sound, plug your ears, and come back and check in an hour or 2 or 5 and see if it's done. It's an appalling place that this country has gone, 60 million babies. And I've supported every piece of pro-life legislation that's come before this Congress, and including the Born Alive bill. I support the ban on abortions for sex selection. I support the pain-capable bill, which passed the House here last October and went over to the Senate, where thankfully the Senate had a vote on the pain-capable bill. And it failed, and we knew it would fail. But it did establish that there's a pro-life majority, at least under those parameters, in the United States Senate. And I believe there will be some senators who are held accountable for that vote. And so, Mr. Speaker, I want to make it clear that I believe this. I believe that life begins at the moment of conception, begins at fertilization. And from that point forward, it is a unique being that is growing and multiplying and shaping. And within about 18 days, we have scientific evidence that the heart starts to beat. We know that there's nerve activity. We know that that baby by about 20 weeks is clear, and I say actually irrefutable, that the baby feels pain. We watch them in ultrasound move around in the womb and squirm. We held a hearing last November 1st where we watched probably the youngest witness to ever testify before the United States Congress, and his name is Lincoln Glenn Miller. This little boy was 18 weeks into development, and we watched him on ultrasound as he jerked his arm towards his face, sucked his thumb, moved his lips like he was trying to talk to us, squirmed around. This little guy, Lincoln Glenn Miller, showed us the humanity inside the womb here in this United States Congress for the first time. So at the funeral of Phyllis Schlafly, who prior to her death was a living, breathing icon, a very principled individual, someone who had the clearest thinker of our time. I read most all of Phyllis's writings and followed her closely and counted her a friend. And she has had a powerful impact upon this country. But at her funeral, Janet Porter of Faith to Action and I sat down and talked about something that Phyllis had asked. Would I bring a heartbeat bill to the floor of the House of Representatives and push it through for a vote here on the floor successfully? Phyllis never wanted to do anything unsuccessfully, and I don't either, Mr. Speaker. and send it over to the Senate and work to nurture it over there so it can get to the President's desk for a signature. Because we have gone through 45 years of incrementalism, 45 years 45 years of a little bill here, a little bill there that saved a few lives here and a few lives there. Henry Hyde, the leader in the pro-life movement, and he was a glorious man that I had the privilege to serve with here in this Congress, and I enjoyed that time with him. Henry Hyde brought the Hyde Amendment, and that extrapolated into the Mexico City policy. And the Hyde Amendment, coupled with the Mexico City policy, has saved 1 million lives, perhaps as many as 2 million lives during that period of time. I was involved in the ban on partial birth abortion, and there we first saw the Supreme Court overturn our ban on partial birth abortion, that ghastly tactic of turning a baby around in the womb and delivering the baby breech, feet first, until that baby's head and face are still inside the mother, and then poking a pair of scissors or a scalpel into the back of that baby's head and sticking a suction in and sucking the brains out to collapse the skull and removing the balance of that baby as that baby squirmed for mercy until the brain tissue was emptied from its skull. Mr. Speaker, that sickening and ghastly and ghoulish tactic was outlawed by this Congress, and it went to circuit courts around the country. And those circuit courts found it unconstitutional because they couldn't overturn Roe v. Wade or Doe v. Bolton. And so it came to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court, in the first round of the ban on partial birth abortion, found that killing a baby in that ghastly fashion was entirely constitutional because the Congress had failed to precisely define, to the satisfaction of the Supreme Court, the act of partial birth abortion, and had failed to demonstrate by congressional findings that a partial birth abortion was never necessary to save the life of the mother. And so, Mr. Speaker, we went back to work. We went back to the Judiciary Committee, and we held hearings before the Judiciary Committee, hearing after hearing after hearing. We got out the word processor again. It was a word processor in those days, and we precisely defined the act of partial birth abortion. When I describe it here, it's more ghastly than I have ever spoken publicly, and I regret the damage that it does to the ears and the psyche of the people that are listening tonight, Mr. Speaker. It needs to be said, but we defined that act absolutely precisely from a medical perspective, and we had a lot of sets of eyes and ears on it to weigh in on all approaches that we could do. And we had, with those hearings, medical doctor after medical doctor came through and testified. In the end, we had congressional findings that concluded definitively that a partial birth abortion was never medically necessary to save the life of the mother. And so we defined the act. We proved it was never necessary to save the life of the mother. We passed the legislation, House and Senate, and it went off to be litigated again to 3 separate federal circuits. One of them in Lincoln, Nebraska, which I attended, Judge Kopp. I'll not forget that. But each of those circuits all found that our bill was unconstitutional in partial birth abortion. Not because we didn't define the act precisely enough, and not because our congressional findings weren't that, because they did prove that it was never necessary for partial birth abortion to save the life of the mother. They found our second bill unconstitutional because of the precedent called stare decisis. Stare decisis is the precedent that the court respects a previous decision. And so anybody that thinks that there's a piece of pro-life legislation that'll save any lives that's going to be upheld at the lower court level is, I think, barking up the wrong tree. It's not going to happen that any lower court, and lower federal court in the United States, is going to overturn a Supreme Court decision, because they will respect stare decisis, the decision of the Supreme Court. And there are too many justices who have served in the past on the Supreme Court who would also honor that stare decisis decision. And if a similar case comes before them, they would look at the decisions that were made before and say, well, I guess the court's already resolved this. There's no reason for us to look at this. There's going to be no de novo review. It's simply going to be whatever the court has decided in the past. We're not going to challenge that going forward. We'll build all case law on the case law that's behind us as we go forward. That's an adherence to stare decisis. And that's what we must overturn if we're ever to put an end to abortion in this country. That's why we have written legislation in the heartbeat bill that is designed to challenge Roe v. Wade and Doe v. Bolton and ask a new Supreme Court, after we pass the heartbeat legislation, H.R. 490, and bring it to this floor, get this vote, pass it over to the Senate. When the day comes that we've got the votes in the House and the Senate, and we have a president that will sign the legislation today, if we could get it there, and a vice president that seems to be enthusiastic about this. And I noticed that the political advisor for the president, Kellyanne Conway, had a heartbeat pin on her dress as she spoke just a week or so ago. I appreciate that support that's there. But with all those signatures, with the votes that are here now in this House, and the votes that need to be compiled in the Senate and a presidential signature, we can ban abortion. If a heartbeat can be detected, the baby shall be protected. That's a heartbeat bill, H.R. 490. But when it's passed, and I pray God it is, and soon, it will go to the lower courts because the pro-abortion lobby will litigate everything. Nothing seems to get to their conscience, and they will litigate it. And we don't expect to win at the lower court level. It all has to go to the Supreme Court. And when we designed this path for this legislation, it was designed for a pro-life majority in the House, which we have. A pro-life majority in the Senate, which was proven just a week ago, we have. And a president that will sign that legislation, a pro-life president who said just a few days ago that he's a pro-life president. Again, I appreciate that reinforcement. We designed it for all of that with the expectations it would go before not the court at the time we wrote the bill and not the court now. Perhaps the court now, but more likely a court that would be formed by a subsequent appointment or two made by this President Donald Trump. All of that needs to be lined up for the heartbeat bill to have success. And we should remember that this isn't a function of waiting for the Supreme Court to be where we think it's favorable alone. Instead, it's a function that there have to be 4 windows that are opened in the right sequence, and we have to fly through those windows. And so the first window is open right now, the House of Representatives. We just need a speaker and a majority leader that will schedule the vote here on the floor with 170 co-sponsors on this legislation and a good long list of folks that want to vote for the bill that just weren't ready to sign on yet. We will get there, Mr. Speaker. That's window number 1. We've got to fly the heartbeat bill through window number 1. And then send it over to the Senate, and we've got to fly the heartbeat bill through window number 2. That's harder. It's harder with the filibuster rule, a 60-vote majority. But with 60 million lives at stake, maybe the 60-vote majority is not such a requirement. Perhaps they'd be willing to waive that long tradition for the purposes of saving lives. That'll be my argument. We've got 60 million lives we've lost in this country, and you're requiring 60 votes in the Senate, and that sets the stage for another 60 million lives to be aborted if you can't get rid of that filibuster rule and let a simple majority pass something through the Senate. The window in the House is open now. The window in the Senate can be opened if the heartbeat bill goes over there. The window at the White House is open right now. And the court, it's going to take a little time. But if we sit back and we decide we don't want to send something out this window of the House because we don't think the Senate is ready, or we don't think the President is ready, by the way, or if we don't think the court is ready, then there will be a window closed and it'll be too late. We've got to move this legislation through. It's H.R. 490, the heartbeat bill, that says this, that before an abortionist can ply his trade, he must first check for a heartbeat. And if a heartbeat can be detected, the baby is protected. That simple, that clear. And we have the technology now that shows that definitive heartbeat on ultrasound, where you can watch the baby move and squirm and gurgle and suck its thumb and try to talk and do all those lovable things. We have that technology that shows that in ultrasound. We have it, take your home kit home and listen to the heartbeat of your baby. I get them texted to me from young ladies that are moms already, and they're already bonding with that unborn baby. That technology says that at about 6 weeks, we can determine the definitive nature of that heartbeat. And if that heartbeat can be detected, the baby is protected. But Mr. Speaker, here's the problem that we have. 170 members signed on to this bill. Another good bunch of them want this bill to come to the floor and they want to vote on it. The will of the people is reflected through the United States Congress, especially the House of Representatives. And unelected people on the outside of this Congress are the ones that are holding this bill back. When I talk to the leadership up the line and I say, I want to vote on the heartbeat bill, and so do 170 members that signed on and multiple others that want to vote for it, the will of this Congress is clear. But the leadership says, we've got it. We don't want to divide the pro-life community. We want to make sure that the pro-life community is unanimous in this before we'll move legislation. I think that's an old rule that was put in place. It wouldn't be my rule. Well, so the top organizations along the way would be National Right to Life, the oldest and largest pro-life organization in the country. Now, I've named them. I can name every other organization from Family Research Council to Susan B. Anthony List to Faith to Action, on down the line. And I will name a bunch of them a little later this evening, Mr. Speaker. Every other organization that I name supports this bill. The only organization that doesn't support it is National Right to Life. And here's what they tell me. I say, National Right to Life, protecting Americans since 1968. The oldest pro-life organization, the largest pro-life organization. I say we need you on this bill because it's not going to move until you say you support it, or the rest of Congress rises up in a very strong way. So here's their answer. They tweeted this out here a little while back. National Right to Life does not oppose the heartbeat bill. That was their message. Does not oppose. But in order for a piece of pro-life legislation to move, according to what I think is an archaic rule, there have to be unanimous. So that means FRC, Family Research Council, Susan B. Anthony List, those two, and National Right to Life. If they all say we like this bill, we want to move it, then H.R. 490, the heartbeat bill, moves, Mr. Speaker. If they don't say they like the bill, it is a de facto veto that blocks the bill. So the will of 170 members who signed on, and a good number of folks who were willing to vote for the bill that didn't sign on, the will of the American people reflected in this constitutional republic that we are, is all being stifled and frustrated by one organization. It happens to be the oldest and the largest pro-life organization in the United States of America, the National Right to Life. Since 1968, they say National Right to Life does not oppose the heartbeat bill. That is H.R. 490. There's no doubt about that. I've had my conversations with Carol Tobias, and I've had my conversation with David Osteen. I've had my conversation, by the way, not in person, only by phone. We couldn't get an in-person meeting. But a couple of their lawyers came in and we had that conversation too. They all say the same thing. They all say, well, our board doesn't like the heartbeat bill and doesn't support the heartbeat bill. And so we can't act unless our board tells us to act. So when was your last board meeting? Oh, several months ago. And there won't be another one until after the March for Life. This conversation took place first week in December. So call a special board meeting because this is important. The heartbeat bill grew a lot more momentum than you ever thought it was going to. It wasn't your idea, I know. I'd give it to you as an idea if that's what National Right to Life wants. They can't meet with their board. They can't call a board meeting. They can't poll their board. They have to wait till the next scheduled board meeting. Who are these board members? I don't know, 50 of them. Can you imagine, Mr. Speaker? Can you imagine 50 dedicated pro-life people in America that are on the board of National Right to Life, And all of them sitting there intransigently saying, nope, I don't want to see the heartbeat bill move. It's not something I want to do. I don't support protecting babies from the moment that a heartbeat can be detected. How in the world is it that you are the preeminent right-to-life organization in the country, and the best you can do is say you do not oppose the heartbeat bill? Real truth is, if you don't oppose it, neither do you support it. What it really means is the National Right to Life does not support the heartbeat bill for whatever those reasons are, Mr. Speaker, for whatever those reasons are. And I'd sure like to know, because I think if you truly are pro-life, then there wouldn't be a way you could sit there and say, I don't want to protect the babies that have a heartbeat. In fact, if I look through their tweets and their literature, it's full of references to heartbeat. And I'll get to that in a little bit, Mr. Speaker, but I wanted to hear from the gentleman from Texas and set the stage a little bit here. And then, so I'd be happy to yield so much time as he may consume to the gentleman from Texas and yield to Louis Gohmert. And I thank him.
Well, I thank my very dear friend from Iowa, Mr. King, for all his work in this area, not just his work, but his leadership. I know his heart beats with a desire to make sure that any heart beating is protected. And I heard a comedian on television this last night saying something about, yeah, so many years ago I had an abortion because it's my choice, something of that order. And the audience cheered and clapped, and I thought, a comedian? And my heart wasn't angry. My heart just broke for that child. And as my friend knows, my wife and I, our first child came 8 to 10 weeks early, and they tried for 3 days to stop the contractions. And after 3 days, it was clear our daughter was coming. And back then, it was far enough back that we really didn't know if we were going to be able to keep her. The first day she was there in Tyler, we were losing her. And I had malpractice cases as a judge that involved the condition. I know for preemies, they don't like to give too much extra oxygen because you get to 100%. It may cause blindness because it's a condition called retrolental fibroplasia. The retina is not matured enough, and in the presence of oxygen, the blood vessels constrict and cause little fibers to come out, separates from the back of the wall. I knew all of that. I knew all about what was going on, and when the pediatrician came in and tried to intubate our child, tried to get that tube in. He didn't intubate a lot of children, but just a wonderful doctor, caring. But they lost her 3 times. The monitors went off. They got her going again, tried to get the tube in so they could get more oxygen to her little undeveloped lungs. He didn't know I was sitting there in the nurse's station watching. It was like a horror movie. I was sorry that I ever started watching it, but I could not leave till I found out how it came out. Also there praying for my child and the doctor's hands and what he was doing, but he finally got her intubated and came out just sweating profusely because he had had that little child's life in his hands. And I'd already held our child. I could hold her in one hand. I was careful and preferred to use 2. But anyway, he made clear we needed to take her either to Dallas or Shreveport. And at that time, now all kids, if they have to go somewhere, they go to Dallas in state from Tyler. But at that time, I said, well, which is more successful? He said, it seems like the survival rate in Shreveport right now is a little better. I don't know what it is now. But so I said, let's get her to Shreveport. So I wasn't sure. Kathy had to stay in the hospital there in Tyler, but I followed the ambulance and made sure she was checked in. And when I got over there, the doctor, I could understand why they had such a good survival rate. His name was Dr. Singh, Tsing. And he, with one of the nurses, got me over to our daughter's little isolette. It's open air. They have the monitors hooked up. They've got a halo around her head, piping in extra oxygen. And he said, please sit down here on the stool. And he said, now, you're probably aware that her eyes are not functioning properly. She can't recognize you when she opens her eyes and tries to see. But he said, she knows your voice. She's been listening to your voice for months. She knows you. And she's comforted by your voice because she knows you. And so you sit here and you talk to her and you caress her little arms and face and talk to her. And you will do some good for her. So, and they said, we have a 2-hour limit on how long you can sit here. And then you have to take a break for a couple hours, then you can come back. Well, the last thing Kathy had asked was that I do anything I could to help our little girl. So there I sat, and I caressed her little face. And the danger of a child born prematurely, the number one danger is the lungs not being properly developed to get enough air in to actually keep the child alive. And so her breathing from the first moment of birth was very, very shallow, and her heart rate was erratic, very fast, and you could see it on the monitors. Very shallow, very fast, very erratic, breathing and heartbeat. But she had a heartbeat. And as you have said many times, my friend, and Janet said many times, you walk in a room, you see a body not moving, you check to see if there's a heartbeat. And if there's a heartbeat, you got to call an ambulance. You got to do everything you can, try to keep that person living, which is, again, the principle behind the heartbeat bill. And her heart was beating just so very fast and erratically. But when I was playing with her little hand, she took her whole hand and it fit wrapped around the end of my finger, and she held on tight. And it was a tight grip. This is a child, his lungs are not working so well, eyes aren't working that great, but she was holding on and holding tight. And I was there for 3 or 4 hours before Dr. Singh came back. And when he came back, he said, have you looked up at the monitors? And I had not for a couple hours or so. And I looked up. The breathing was very shallow, but it was no longer erratic. It had a regular beat, regular rhythm to it. And the heartbeat was still very fast, but it was not erratic. It was a regular heartbeat with a regular pattern. And Dr. Singh said, she's drawing strength from you. She's drawing life from you. Well, I can tell you, when you know this little child is drawing life from you and strength from you, you don't want to leave. And finally, after 8 hours, the nurses and the doctor came over and they said, you got to leave. It's been 8 hours. I said, I don't want to leave. The monitors show it's got a regular heartbeat, regular breathing. I don't want to leave. And they said, you were supposed to leave 6 hours ago. You got to leave now. Go somewhere. And I did leave and went to McDonald's, and my heart was up there with our daughter, and so I rear-ended a lady right there by McDonald's. And the policeman was very nice, and the lady that lived there in Shreveport was extremely nice. But I couldn't wait to get back to our child. Now, she is extraordinary, absolutely extraordinary in every way. One of the top artists in the world, was chosen to be one of the first 12 artists that the Swatch Peace Hotel, dedicated to the arts in Shanghai, one of the first 12 they selected to live there as artists in residence from all over the world. She was one of the first 12. Amazing talent. I think about the talent of 60 million children. Every one of them had some kind of gift, and they're gone. And I have appreciated the national right to life when I was in college, when I was out of college, and when I was a prosecutor after law school, when I was practicing lawyer, local businessman, my own firm. I was elected to judge. I never slowed my appreciation of the national right to life. And I want to make sure that people understand we also have a Texas right to life. And it's not national right to life. It's its own organization. And I've talked to the Grahams. And the Grahams that head up the Texas Right to Life, God bless them, they've done incredible work. But they make clear we don't care whose bill it is. We don't care who came up with the idea. If there is any bill that will prevent even one precious life from being aborted, that life being saved and allowed a chance to be loved and to love and not to be aborted, they're on board. And that's the way everybody I knew that is pro-choice, meaning you choose to live, that's the way I thought everybody was. So it has been quite an awakening to be here in Washington and to have any group, especially one that I put up on a pedestal for so many years, for decades now, that says our board doesn't support a bill. We have a bill, the pain capable bill. Heck, any bill pain capable, yeah, sign me on. If that saves 5 to 15% of the abortions, count me in, I'm there. And then national right to life, it may save 80, 90% of the children that are being killed. Count me in, I'm in. And I thought that's where everybody would be. And I don't know, I really don't understand. If it's a turf battle, it wasn't our idea, why is it that any group doesn't support saving an additional life? And I do read the Bible every day. Made that promise I would read the Bible, and I do that. And I've just gone again through some of the Old Testament books, and when I read the prophets talk about how evil a society was, they'd say this king, he did right in the eyes of the Lord. This king did evils in the eyes of the Lord. When the writer wants to really illustrate the point that a society had become so evil that it was an abomination to God, they would point out that, and they sacrificed their children on the altar of an idol. And I remember reading that as a kid, and I thought, what could be worse than that? I just cannot imagine a parent being willing to sacrifice their child. I can imagine my parents, lots of parents, fighting to the death to protect their child. But I just couldn't imagine how that could happen in these Old Testament days. And then came to realize we've been doing that since the 70s. We've been sacrificing these children that could survive on their own. on the altar of individual choice. That I'm too busy to do other things. I don't have time for a child. When there are parents begging for children to adopt. So I just appreciate so much, my friend, speaking up on behalf of the unborn. We've heard from our Democratic friends so many times that society is judged by the way they protect those who cannot protect themselves and help those who cannot protect themselves. Clearly, there is nobody more innocent and more in need of protection than a child not quite born that someone wants to kill. So I appreciate my friend's illumination of what's going on. I thank you for your efforts, not just tonight, but every day. And I yield back to my friend from Iowa, Mr. King.
Reclaim my time. I so much thank the gentleman from Texas for that deep and heartfelt description of what it was like. That miracle little child who also is intelligent and beautiful, as well as a world-class artist. And, you know, Mr. Speaker, I stand here and I don't understand national right to life either. This is exactly what they're formed for. It fits the heartbeat bill. H.R. 490 is an exact fit, as near as I can determine, into their very mission statement. And I made it a point to look up that mission statement, and I happen to have it here. The National Right to Life's mission statement, Mr. Speaker, goes this way. The mission of the National Right to Life is to protect and defend the most fundamental right of humankind, the right to life of every innocent human being from the beginning of life to natural death. Now, if that's National Right to Life's position and mission, from the beginning of life to natural death, I certainly support that. I don't think we disagree on when life begins, but one might read that statement literally and say from the beginning of life to natural death, maybe National Right to Life's position is something other than the moment of fertilization or the moment of conception on when life begins, because the mission statement doesn't say from fertilization to natural death or conception to natural death. It says from the beginning of life to natural death. But I dig a little deeper, and on their website, they have a statement that says, and it both starts with a question, when does life begin? And it answers its question this way. It said, the life of a baby begins long before he or she is born. A new individual human being begins at fertilization when the sperm and ovum meet to form a single cell. Perfect. I agree with that answer. So, they are then formed. The mission is to protect and defend the most fundamental right of humankind, the right to life of every innocent human being from the beginning of life to natural death, National Right to Life's mission statement, and they define the beginning of life as when at fertilization, when the sperm and ovum meet to form a single cell. All right, so there should be no argument any longer. Where does National Right to Life stand? They should be standing for protecting all innocent life from fertilization to natural death. It's a fine and honorable position, and the history of National Right to Life has actually spoken to the heartbeat issue and the heartbeat bill. For example, there was a heartbeat bill that passed out of the North Dakota state legislature back in 2009, and it went to a federal circuit court where it was not upheld by that federal circuit court, just as I described a little earlier. The lower courts will not overturn a decision made by the Supreme Court. It has to be appealed to the Supreme Court level. This was not, but they were supporting the heartbeat bill then. So they're on record supporting the heartbeat bill. And here are a number of other times on their positions on heartbeat. Heartbeat's been showing up pretty often in the information that's come out of National Right to Life. And I point out again their lead, Carol Tobias or David Osteen. But here's one, this is 5th of February 2013, Right to Life's tweet that went out. National Right to Life's tweet. It's at NRLC if you want to send them a message. It says, unborn child's heartbeat, the most beautiful music, says Beyonce. I looked that up because I wondered what that was. And Beyonce was pregnant. She actually had a miscarriage and lost that child and loved that child before that child was born, and I don't have any doubt that her heart was broken. But she said, an unborn child's heartbeat is the most beautiful music. And that's posted on National Right to Life's on their Twitter page. And then I go on, that's February of 2013. Here's July of 2013, a tweet from them. Unborn babies can feel pain, they can dream, they have a heartbeat. They respond to their mother's voice. Abortion ends their life. Looks like National Right to Life understands the importance of heartbeat. I think they know, something that I think I also know, is that that beating heart is in our ears now. Many of us have heard that beating heart on ultrasound. And when we hear that on ultrasound, we know that's life. And we also know that if that heartbeat can be detected and the baby is protected, that baby has at least a 95% chance of a successful birth. And so that's how viable that baby is at 6 weeks with a heartbeat. Heartbeat. Here's another tweet. 24 September 2014. Right to Life's Twitter account. Listen to an unborn baby's heartbeat at just 6 weeks. Just the amount of time that I gave you. Another heartbeat message. Going on down the line. This is 2014 also. A Right to Life tweet. Did you know babies by 20 weeks can feel pain? That's the pain capable bill that just failed in the Senate. They already have a heartbeat and detectable brain waves by then. Heartbeat about 6 weeks. And so they're telling us this heartbeat matters. A heartbeat is a sure sign of life. If there's a heart beating there, there's a live baby there. And a baby with a 95% chance or better of successful birth. Moving on in 2014 also, here's Carol Tobias, the lead in National Right to Life. She tweets out on this day, 24 March 2014, new smartphone accessory, rather than accessory allows moms to hear unborn child's heartbeat. I'm glad that we've been noticed this. It was important that we know that. That's the place where these heartbeat sounds have been texted to me from young mothers that are, say, 6 weeks along or 7 or 8 weeks along. They'll send me the sound of that heartbeat. And I can open up, it comes on my phone, and I can open that up, and I can hear that heartbeat and surging at, say, 158 beats per minute. That's one of the most precious that came to me about 2.5 weeks ago, 158 beats a minute. Here's the next tweet that comes down. This is February 2015. This is an abortionist, and that's National Right to Life's tweet, quoting an abortionist who said, I know that the fetus is alive during the process, meaning the process of abortion. I can see fetal heartbeat on the ultrasound. I can see the heartbeat on the ultrasound. That abortionist stops that beating heart. That ends the life of that baby. But this is why Right to Life put this up. They know that heartbeat beats also in our conscience. It beats in theirs. They want to stop abortions. That's their mission statement. They're the oldest organization in the country, the largest organization in the country. The heartbeat bill couldn't more perfectly fit their mission statement, their cause for being, or the messages that come out here time after time in what one would presume would be laying down the predicate for the heartbeat bill itself. Here's another one, Right to Life. Their tweet that comes out and says, I have a heartbeat. It's a baby. I have detectable brain waves. I can feel pain. Don't I deserve human rights? Yes. As soon as we can possibly provide them and stop this carnage of abortion, don't I deserve the human right to life, is what this quote is, put out by National Right to Life. And going on to another tweet, this one is in November of 2017. There's a continuum here that brings this thing through to 2017. National Right to Life's tweet that says, did you know an unborn child's heartbeat starts around 20 days into a pregnancy? Most mothers don't even know they are pregnant by that time. Not easily detectable, not detectable by the technology that we call for in the heartbeat bill, but that's how early that is. Knights of Columbus put up billboards that say, my heart began beating at 18 days. We all start small. Abortion stops a beating heart. Heart, heart, heart. It rings in our conscience. It should ring in the conscience of National Right to Life. Here's National Right to Life in their tweets. Heartbeat, 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 heartbeat. Why not support the heartbeat bill? You actually are doing so verbally here, but you go back to this canard. National Right to Life does not, you want to say oppose. The National Right to Life wants to say oppose, Mr. Speaker. But instead, I say it's more appropriate to say they do not support the heartbeat bill. Why? It's beyond my comprehension how an organization that has this kind of convictions cannot be supporting the heartbeat bill. We have polling that tells us where this stands. It's a majority opinion all the way across the board. In a Barna poll taken in 2017, 69% of adults support the heartbeat bill. Actually, it's slightly slightly more polling support than the pain-capable bill that's already passed the House and just failed in the Senate, but with a majority vote. 69% of adults support the heartbeat bill, 86% of Republicans, 55% of Democrats. Even pro-choice / pro-abortion Democrats, their people that vote for them, support them, also support the heartbeat bill with what we'd call a supermajority, excuse me, not a supermajority, but a landslide level if it were an election, and 61% independents. 86% of Republicans support heartbeat, 55% of Democrats, 61% of independents support heartbeat. We're getting down to the place here where it's making even less and less sense that National Right to Life would not support the heartbeat bill. And there's another big set of reasons here. And Mr. Speaker, this isn't the whole set of reasons. This is maybe half, maybe not quite half the set of reasons. 130, not only 170 members of Congress have signed onto this bill, and a good number of them that will vote for it on the whip card on top of that, but 130 pro-life organizations and leaders support the heartbeat bill, H.R. 490. You can't read this from very far away because we tried to jam as many names on there as we could, and there's another sheet behind this at least, and probably another one behind that. 130 pro-life organizations. We looked down through that. Who are we missing? I couldn't come up with anybody that we were missing as far as supporting this other than National Right to Life. Am I looking on top here? Here's the Susan B. Anthony list. We'll put that at the top of the list. Here's Tony Perkins and the president of the Family Research Council. These are the top 3 organizations right here that are, some have referred to as the Holy Trinity, that control pro-life legislation, and whether it comes to the United States Congress or not, whether the will of the people can be realized, is being stuck right here in red. So we put this in red. I held this back, reserved this spot on this sheet for Carol Tobias of the National Right to Life. Just pick up the phone, call the speaker. This is all, Mr. Speaker, that that Carol Tobias needs to do. And the heartbeat bill comes to the floor of the House. And the will of the people can be reflected. And it can go over to the Senate. And it can sit on Mitch McConnell's desk. And they can have a vote over there. And we'll find out where those senators all are. And if it doesn't pass on the floor of the Senate, there might just be some new senators sent in that will protect innocent unborn human life. So I can go down the list. Lila Rose, the president of Live Action, a strong supporter, enthusiastic supporter of the heartbeat bill. Tom McClusty, March for Life. We sat down and had a conversation. He's supporting of this. And then we've got Kristen Hawkins, the president of Students for Life. On down the line, Anita Staver, president of the Liberty Council. Ed Martin, the president of Phyllis Schlafly's organization, the Eagle Forum. He's the Eagles president. He's solidly in support of heartbeat. In fact, he was there in that church that day that we put this plan together, and he's been a driving force. But the real strongest driving force of all is Janet Porter, the president of Faith to Action. Janet Porter really carried this in the state of Ohio. I went to Ohio to help conclude that. What we found out in the state of Ohio is that not only did the heartbeat bill pass in Ohio, Mr. Speaker, but it passed over the resistance of the local affiliate of the National Right to Life. And they will tell me, and David Osteen told me, that they're not in control of their state organizations. You heard Congressman Gomert address that also, that the state organizations kind of run their own show. But when it was resisted in Ohio, it made no sense. And they lobbied to get John Kasich to veto the bill. Why? under the grounds that it would be found unconstitutional by the Supreme Court in Ohio? Seriously? Do we go to all that work and then just decide we're going to preempt the court decision, pass a law, sign it into law, and save the babies' lives? Every step we take along the way saves lives. And Keith Rothfuss made an argument that I want to give him credit for. He said, even just debating the heartbeat bill saves lives, because the debate causes people to talk about it, to think about it differently, and to make different decisions about the lives that they are in charge of protecting, and that's the innocent unborn lives. And so here we are with 130 pro-life organizations and leaders support the heartbeat bill, H.R. 490. We look down through this list, and I'll put it all public if it needs be, Mr. Speaker, but I saved the spot up here in red for Carol Tobias and David Osteen and the National Right to Life. Just give us a call, send me an email, a text, pick up the phone, call the speaker. We'll move this bill, and we'll save lives together. And meanwhile, if that doesn't happen, I'm going to continue to ask the question, how in the world can you not support this bill? How in the world can the nation's preeminent pro-life organization, National Right to Life, who says they do not oppose the heartbeat bill, and I say they do not support the heartbeat bill, how can that be? How can you form 50 people on a board of directors, all of them pledged and dedicated to your mission statement to protect life from the beginning of life to natural death, and not find one among those 50 that support the heartbeat bill when 170 co-sponsors are already on it here in the House of Representatives and multiple others are standing up ready to vote for the bill, and there's not one among you, not one among your board that supports the heartbeat bill? There's something wrong. There's something wrong inside an organization. Maybe those statements came both from Carol Tobias and David Osteen. Maybe there were a couple along the way. There's a little clause in there, but generally this: who on your board supports the heartbeat bill? Can't name any. That's essentially it. If that's the case, Mr. Speaker, then there's something seriously wrong in the National Right to Life, and something that seriously needs to be corrected, because there are babies who must be protected. If a heartbeat can be detected, the baby is protected. And we need the support of the entire pro-life community in order to get this legislation moved out of the House and over to the Senate, to the President's desk. It will eventually get before a Supreme Court. We'll eventually have one or two more appointments to that Supreme Court. It's got a shot today. It's clearly more constitutional than the pain-capable legislation because it's precisely drafted with these things all in mind. It's a solid case to go before the Supreme Court. I would say instead there's no reason to litigate it, but I kind of think it will be, because the enemies to life litigate everything that saves and protects lives. But these little babies are too precious, they're too unique, they're too miraculous for us to waste a minute in protecting their lives. And I want every little baby that's got a heartbeat, every little baby, to have that chance to be born, that chance to live, to love, to laugh, to learn, to worship, to be a parent of its own, and to be a gift from God to this country, to this planet, and to posterity. That's the miracle of every little child. When Congressman Gohmert spoke of being able to hold his little daughter in one hand, and that sacred, protected little girl now has grown into a glorious and beautiful and intelligent woman who's contributing to this society and to this world. And that's true for everyone. We all give glory to God. But 60 million babies cannot continue. We have to put an end to this atrocity of abortion. The heartbeat bill, H.R. 490, does that. And there's only one entity standing in the way, and that's National Right to Life. And I plead with you, and I pray that you will come around to support. Your history says that's who you are and what you do. And it's time now to get on the bill. Mr. Speaker, with that, I would conclude and yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. Members are reminded to direct their remarks to the chair and not to a perceived viewing audience. Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 3rd, 2017, the chair recognizes the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Soda, until 10 o'clock.